It has been said many times that if behaviorism was an empire, it has fallen. At a time, behaviorism was not just a wing of psychology, but it was a defining feature of this field. Behaviorism was so influential at a time, not only because of the revolutionary scientific work being done, but also because of how these self-proclaimed behaviorists would vehemently argue for science to be reformed. These behaviorists, this weird folk, they had this philosophy of science, this perspective to science, and this culture of discourse that pervaded their research papers and their conferences that contrasted starkly to other prevailing perspectives on psychology as a scientific practice at the time and today. For psychology students across the world, behaviorism will be covered early on in their introductory to Psych 101 classes, when those classes goes over the history of this field. B.F. Skinner, with his pigeons and box in hand, will be placed neatly between figures like Milgram and Freud. This can give the illusion that behaviorism is either dead or an artifact. But as many psychology students later figure out, behaviorism is live and well. For clinical psychology students trying to study behavioral processes, or students of behavior analysis trying to become BCBAs, students quickly learn that the relevance of behaviorism to science and intervention can be observed across the world. But to those whose training demands them to become a behaviorist, they have hard days ahead of them, and they better have a friend. It's hard to find pop psychologists these days who have primarily behavioral orientations, and if you are going to hear from a primarily behaviorist perspective, it will not be viral, let alone even on YouTube, but instead in some obscure lecture hall, deep in the annals of your psychology department building. And this presents an educational challenge. With foundational figures like Skinner now gone, and no new psychologists who are behaviorists who have nearly as much fame, when the behavioral professors go home, this leaves students with just behaviorist writings when doing homework or trying to explain at the bar to their friends, what the hell are they studying in these graduate classes? And that brings forward a massive challenge, because behaviorist writings are incredibly difficult to understand. Now, I want to take an intermission really quick to talk about a personal anecdote. I was in a situation recently where I needed to explain radical behaviorism. I needed to explain it to someone, and it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I would like to share that experience with you. It was almost 6 months ago from today, exactly. I was driving to a mall in Long Island, New York, to pick up my girlfriend who was there. It was already very anxiety-provoking. The GPS was messing up. I was driving a rental car. It was my first time driving in the Darwinian streets of New York. And I had woken up at 4 a.m. to drive from Philly, where I live, to New York to attend a funeral ceremony, of which I was the last person to speak. And so I'm driving, trying to find this mall, trying to decode the directions, still jittery from bawling my eyes out. And then there was a person in the passenger seat. Someone who took an hour-long Uber ride to that same funeral ceremony, and instead of taking an hour-long Uber ride back, decided that they would ride home with me, and that I could drop them off at their home on the way when I go home, if I would be open to it. To which, of course, I was. Because this person was and is one of the biggest social psychologists of our time. He was a 2-time, and as of these past few weeks, now a 3-time New York Times best-selling author, the social psychologist, Dr. Jonathan Haidt. Now, up until this time, I thought I would be willing to have a conversation about radical behaviorism to anybody. until I got in a car with that guy. That was the person I found myself stumbling over my words, trying to explain behaviorism to. But before I tell you about this absolute pickle of hell I found myself in, first, I'd like to give you an introduction to our lecture series. See, that's what I try and do. I try and grip you with a story and leave you on the cliffhanger, so you tune in, all right? In this lecture series, I'll be aiming to give an introduction to radical behaviorism. I guess technically, since this video is an introduction to the lecture series, this video would be an introduction to an introduction to an introduction to radical behaviorism. But why, you might ask? Why give a whole lecture series on an introduction to radical behaviorism? Well, that's because someone beat me to it. An introduction to radical behaviorism already exists. Actually, they did not beat me to it. I would not want to do that. It's quite thorough. The book is called About Behaviorism by B.F. Skinner, and it is an introduction to radical behaviorism. As you can see, it's a small book, easily able to be stored in maybe a large coat pocket or a pouch. I'm very thankful. This is the late Bob Kohlenberg's copy of About Behaviorism, recently passed. He was the co-creator of functional analytic psychotherapy and the distinguished professor at the University of Washington. This tiny book took me about 25 hours to get about 60% through. By all intents and purposes, yes, this book is tiny, but by all intents and purposes, this book is a tomb. Be very careful with it. There are two reasons why that book is so difficult to read. Firstly, because of the unending introduction of vocab words and terms that I was unfamiliar with. Reading that book can be likened to trying to read a book on Russian culture. Maybe it's one of the best books on Russian culture in the world, but the book is written in Russian and all you speak is English. There are many terms in the behavioral canon, so much so that it's easy to find yourself lost in, and sadly, these 3 lectures will not help you in that. Simply regarding that, navigating that great vista ahead of you, behavioral students, if that's what you're going to have to learn how to do, simply I wish you luck and maybe great endurance. And apologies, that's all I can offer. But there was a second reason why About Behaviorism, that tiny book, was such a laborious, titanic read for me. And it was not because of the terminology, but the second reason was because of the perspective. What might be even more confusing than the many terms in the behaviorist vocab is the many terms that are not in the behaviorist vocab. The behaviorists don't have intuitions. They don't say language, but verbal community. The behaviorists, to even use a term like mind or self-expression around them in a general vicinity, a tenacious amount of translation is needed for those terms even to make theoretical sense. Now, these behaviorists are not assholes who hate fun. These behaviorists are people with a different culture to science than the scientific mainstream. And there are reasons why their perspective differs so much. Now, I'm going to be a bit sacrilegious here and say that this underlying difference can be called the behavioral intuition. Yes. To a radical behaviorist, this is wrong in many ways. But I believe explaining the behavioral perspective to non-behaviorists using behavioral language is a hellish exercise that many behaviorists have been through enough. So I'm done repeating this generational torture. As Ice Cube might say it, F the police, or at least the verbal community. Instead, I'm going to break all the rules in this lecture series in the hopes that in this lecture series you will understand this behavioral intuition, and first in words that you understand. And my hope is by the end of this lecture series, you will also understand why a behaviorist would not call it an intuition and what they might be oriented to instead. So back to story time. I'm in the car with this titan of academia, one of the faces of social psychology, which, may I remind you, is not behaviorally oriented. And so we're talking about social media, right? Because that's what we talk about. And Haidt is talking about how, people tend to act differently depending on their personality types, and men tend to act in this way, but women tend to act differently. And if you look at these, and I as we're talking, I mentioned to him, I say that I have a background in contextual behavioral sciences, and this influences how I see things. So it makes it kind of difficult for me to think about behavior in terms of these characteristics or personality constructs. And I mentioned that contextual behavioral sciences has a background in the behaviorist view of psychology. And I just kind of whisper, not whisper, but just say in passing that the behaviorist view of psychology, which has largely fallen out of fashion, to which he interjected and also said in passing, for good reason, and fear ran down my spine like an animal. For good reason. I turned to him and looked in horror. Actually, I think I looked pretty normal, but that's what it felt like. And I realized what he just said. For good reason. And it hit me. This man's a social psychologist. He has no sympathy. He probably doesn't understand what behaviorism is at all. And so mustering all the courage that I had, this guy probably thought behaviorism died, and Skinner was good as dead when Noam Chomsky wrote that paper, right? So mustering all the courage I had in my soul, I turned to him, and I said, so actually, I'm a behaviorist, and behaviorism, specifically radical behaviorism, has both been largely misunderstood and has also changed a lot in its most modern forms to deal with some of its theoretical shortcomings. And then I look back on the road, and I pause and I take stock again. And I haven't died. It seems I'm all right. And I look over at John quickly, and he is smiling. John's looking at me and nodding. He's curious, and he wants to learn more. And I realize, in terror, even more terror than when I realized he said, for good reason, when this conversation had started, when I realized he wasn't a behaviorist, what was even more terrifying was this moment. When I looked over to him, and I saw he was receptive and he wanted to learn more, it was a moment when I realized I now needed to explain radical behaviorism to this social psychologist. And so I tried my best, and from that moment on, everything went fuzzy. I don't remember what happened. I mentioned mentalism over here. I said, private events over there, something, I don't know. Something about brushing my toothache is as real as my something. I don't remember what I said. But the conversation was cut quickly. The GPS went from kind of confusing to absolute catastrophe. We were getting close to the mall, and we both nodded our heads and agreed to pay attention to the road. And we got to our destination. We got to the mall. We picked up my girlfriend, and the conversation moved on to different topics. And it just happened to never go back to behaviorism. From an outside perspective, I did not explain radical behaviorism because I was interrupted by confusing directions. But the reality was that the confusion of the road stood as a diversion to the confusion I felt within myself. Because the fact of the matter is that while I have spent years studying the practices and products of a modern, contemporary behavioral sciences, I have not acquired, whatever. I did not have an in-depth, articulate understanding of the philosophical roots from which I stand. And so this series, for me personally, is about digging where I stand. Now, the university has made it very clear that my background in radical behaviorism is very limited. So, this lecture series was mentored and overseen by someone with a solid background in behavior analysis, Dr. Charles Wood. Dr. Charles Wood, got to get that right. Charles Wood is the professor of special education at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He is a BCBA, and he got his PhD under the famous behavioral titans of applied behavior analysis, Cooper, Howard, and Heward, which, especially in this next lecture, I will be citing a lot. All profound statements in this lecture can be attributed to me, or all mistakes can be attributed to him. Just kidding, sorry. Anyways, last thing I want to give is an overview of this lecture series. Firstly, I will be discussing what philosophy of science is, and then I'll present science as a philosophical argument. So this is where I'll be most mercilessly citing Cooper, Howard, and Heward, The White Book, 3rd edition, 2020, Applied Behavior Analysis. That's the title. Highly recommend checking it out. So after I talk about what science is to scientists writ large, then I'll be talking about how this implicates to psychology when psychology wants to become a science too. This leads me to explain some of the differences in assumptions between mainstream mentalist psychology and the underdog, the protagonist of this series, the behavioral point of view. These two lectures will try and build a big enough bullet and gun so that we can take a shot at the elephant in the room, but not literally because I love elephants. This third lecture will be diving headfirst into what I am calling here the behavioral intuition, and finally, after I explain that, how a behaviorist might view it instead of using that sacrilegious term, intuition. So this should hopefully offer a philosophical foundation, one that you can always come back to when you find yourself lost in the behavioral terminology, because I dare to suggest that this behavioral intuition, this heart of behaviorism, is actually sensible and immediately relatable, even if behaviorist vocab words are arcane and mysterious. I forgot to take this hat off. But anyways, without further ado, if you can stand my antics and silly voices and jumping around, then let's get on to the next lecture. You know, that wasn't so bad, actually. I said I'm sorry after delivering that joke about Dr. Wood. Why do you apologize for your jokes? But anyways, I think that was pretty good.